March 30, 1944. 2,247 hours. 18,000 feet above Nuremberg, Germany. Flight Sergeant Thomas Brennan of 106 Squadron felt his Lancaster bomber shudder as the first shell detonated 30 yards to starboard. Through the Perspex nose, bomb aimer Ronald Davies watched the sky ahead transform into what veterans called the garden, a field of orange and white flowers blooming in the darkness. Each blossom marking an 88mm shell exploding with enough force to shred aluminum like paper in the next 6 hours. 795 British heavy bombers would fly through a defensive system the Luftwaffe had spent 4 years perfecting. 10,000 heavy flak guns arranged in belts up to 15 miles deep, coordinated by radar, searchlights, and predictive computing equipment that could calculate a bomber's future position and fill that exact space with steel fragments traveling at 2,000 feet per second. What followed was not just an aerial battle, but a mathematical equation written in tracer, fire, and falling aircraft. The Germans had built what their commanders called the Flakgürtel, the flak belt, a defensive network so dense that bomber crews calculated their survival not in missions completed, but in seconds survived while flying through what they knew was a predetermined kill zone, the night sky over. Germany had become the most lethal airspace in human history, and 125,000 British and Commonwealth aircrew would fly into it knowing that statistically, most would never complete their tour of 30 operations. The transformation of German air defense began not with a single innovation, but with a systematic realization that emerged from the ashes of Hamburg in July 1943. General Oberst Joseph Kamhuber, commanding Germany's night fighter forces, had watched RAF Bomber Command devastate Hamburg with firestorms that killed 42,000 civilians in Operation Gemara. The lesson was brutal and immediate. Night fighters alone could not stop the bomber streams that in his headquarters at Zeist in the Netherlands. Kamhuber had already constructed what RAF intelligence called the Kamhuber Line, a chain of radar-guided night fighter zones stretching from Denmark to Switzerland. But the Hamburg raids proved that bombers could saturate these zones, overwhelming the system through sheer numbers. The solution required a weapon that could engage multiple targets simultaneously across vast areas of sky. That weapon already existed. The 8.8 cm Flak 18/36/37, better known to the world as the 88. Developed by Krupp in 1928 and continuously improved. This gun had already proven its versatility as an anti-tank weapon in North Africa. But its true purpose had always been air defense, and by late 1943, German industry was producing them at a rate that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The statistics documented in Luftwaffe ordnance records revealed the scale of deployment. By January 1944, Germany had positioned 10,371 heavy flak guns, 88mm, and larger, in defensive batteries across the Reich. These weren't scattered randomly, but arranged in carefully calculated geometric patterns that RAF intelligence officers spent months mapping from reconnaissance photographs and bomber crew debriefings. The standard gross battery, heavy battery, consisted of 12 guns arranged in a pattern that maximized sky coverage while minimizing friendly fire risk. Guns were positioned 150 meters apart in configurations that created overlapping cones of fire. Each battery could engage targets from 100 feet to 35,000 feet altitude, though optimal lethal range was between 12,000 and 25,000 feet, exactly where RAF heavy bombers operated for maximum bombing accuracy. The mathematics of destruction were coldly efficient. Each 88mm shell weighed 20.3 pounds and contained 2.4 pounds of high explosive surrounded by a steel casing designed to fragment into approximately 1,500 pieces upon detonation. The time fuse, set before firing, would detonate the shell at a predetermined altitude with an accuracy of plus or minus 50 feet when properly calibrated. A single battery of 12 guns, firing at maximum rate, could put 240 shells into a cubic kilometer of sky per minute, with batteries positioned every 5 to 8 kilometers along major approach routes. Bombers would fly through continuous curtains of exploding steel for distances exceeding 60 miles from the German border to primary targets in the Ruhr Valley. But the guns alone didn't make the system lethal. What transformed the Flakgürtel into a killing mechanism was the integration of detection, calculation, and coordination technologies that turned random shooting into predictive mathematics. The Germans had built not just a wall of guns, but a computational system for industrial-scale aerial warfare. The technological foundation that made the Flakgürtel operational had been laid in the late 1930s by German firms Telefunken and Siemens, companies that would transform air defense from reactive shooting to predictive engagement. The system that emerged represented one of the most sophisticated military computing networks of World War II, combining radar detection, mechanical calculation, and coordinated fire control into what Luftwaffe technical manuals called the Flaklight system, the Flak control system. The detection phase began with Würzburg radar units, dish-shaped systems operating on 560 MHz frequency that could detect bomber formations at ranges exceeding 40 kilometers. By 1944, Germany had deployed over 4,000 Würzburg radars, with multiple units positioned around each major flak battery. The radar operators, typically Luftwaffenhelferin, female, auxiliaries who'd replaced men sent to combat. Units would track incoming formations and relay coordinates to the battery command post. What happened next separated German flak from the simpler systems used earlier in the war. The coordinates fed into a Kommandogerät 40, a mechanical computer weighing 1,100 pounds that looked like an oversized typewriter combined with a calculating machine. This device, manufactured by Zeiss, performed ballistic calculations that would have required a trained mathematician several minutes to complete by hand, and did them continuously in real time. The Kommandogerät calculated target altitude, speed, direction, and predicted future position based on observed flight path. It factored in wind speed at multiple altitudes, air temperature, barometric pressure, and even the rotation of the Earth for long-range engagements. The output went directly to each gun in the battery, transmitted electrically to Übertragungsgerät, transmission devices that automatically adjusted gun elevation and traverse. Luftwaffe technical documents captured after the war revealed the system's sophistication. The Kommandogerät 40 could process data for targets moving up to 600 kilometers per hour and calculate firing solutions for shells that would take 30 to 40 seconds to reach altitude. It predicted where the bomber would be when the shell arrived, not where it was when detected, a crucial distinction that made German flak far more deadly than its Allied counterparts. The gun crews themselves, typically 6 men per gun. For guns per Zug, platoon, 3 Zug per battery, didn't aim manually. They simply followed the dials and indicators driven by the Kommandogerät, making continuous adjustments as the mechanical computer updated its predictions. Rate of fire depended on crew efficiency, but well-trained batteries could sustain 15 rounds per minute per gun, with shells leaving the barrel at 2,690 feet per second. The integration went further. Searchlight batteries, positioned forward of the gun lines, used their own radar systems, Würzburg Reese units with larger dishes, to illuminate targets for optical tracking when radar alone proved insufficient. On nights with cloud cover below bomber altitude, the searchlights would point straight up, creating a diffuse glow that silhouetted aircraft for gun-laying purposes. By early 1944, the system had reached maturity. RAF intelligence estimates suggested that a bomber flying through a fully alerted gross battery zone faced a 3 to 5% chance of being hit with lethal damage per minute of exposure, for a typical raid requiring 15 minutes over defended airspace. The cumulative probability approached 45 to 75% for at least one significant hit. The mathematics were simple and terrible. Fly through enough flak, and the numbers would eventually catch you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first-time pilot officer James Hartley of 97 Squadron encountered the full Flakgürtel was on the night of March 18, 1944, approaching Stuttgart. His Lancaster, designated R. Robert, crossed into German airspace at 0142 hours at 19,000 feet. Navigator Peter Ashworth had plotted their course to avoid known concentrations, but RAF intelligence maps were always weeks behind German redeployments. The initial warning came as scattered bursts, what crews called scarecrows, though these were actual flak shells, not the mythical exploding decoys some believed in. Hartley pushed the throttles forward, attempting to increase speed through the zone. Flight engineer Dennis Cooper called out altitude and airspeed every 30 seconds. His voice steady despite the aircraft shaking from near misses. Then they hit the gross battery belt protecting Stuttgart's western approaches. Hartley's after-action report, preserved in 97 squadron records, described what thousands of bomber crews experienced. The sky ahead simply filled with light. Not scattered bursts, but a continuous wall of explosions at our exact altitude. I could see shells detonating in a line directly across our flight path, as if the Germans had drawn a fence in the sky and dared us to fly through it. The tactical reality bomber crews faced was that the Flakgürtel wasn't designed to shoot down every aircraft. That would have been impossible. Instead, German flak doctrine aimed to disrupt bombing accuracy and inflict steady attrition. Luftwaffe tactical manuals captured post-war stated the objective clearly: force bombers to take evasive action during the bombing run, making accurate targeting impossible, and achieve a minimum 5% loss rate per major raid. The loss mathematics worked in Germany's favor through simple accumulation. A 5% loss rate meant that statistically, a crew had only a 36% chance of surviving a standard 30-operation tour. RAF Bomber Command calculated that in 1943 to 1944, the average life expectancy for bomber crews was 14 operations. Flak accounted for approximately 40% of losses, with night fighters responsible for most of the remainder. Crews developed superstitions and tactics to improve their odds, though most had no statistical validity. Some believed flying at the front of the bomber stream reduced flak danger. Actually, it increased it as German batteries were freshest. Others thought evasive maneuvers helped, but the Kommandogerät could track gradual turns. And violent evasive action during the bombing run made accurate bomb release impossible, defeating the mission's purpose. The psychological burden was documented in RAF medical reports. Wing Commander Harold Patterson, medical officer for 5 Group, reported that by 1944, nearly 70% of bomber crew members showed symptoms of operational stress. The knowledge that flak was essentially random, that skill and courage couldn't prevent a shell detonating in your exact position through pure probability, created a unique form of psychological pressure. Unlike combat with fighters, where pilot skill mattered, flak reduced survival to mathematics. You flew the mission profile, maintained formation, and either the numbers caught you or they didn't. Squadron leader William Foster of 576 Squadron described it in his memoir. With fighters, you could fight back, take action, feel some control. With flak, you simply flew into it and waited to discover if this was the night your number came up. It was like playing roulette with your life every time. And the house always had the advantage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. March 30th, 1944 became the operational proving ground for the Flakgürtel's full potential. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commanding RAF Bomber Command, had ordered a maximum effort against Nuremberg, 795 heavy bombers, the largest single-target raid attempted to that date. What he didn't know was that German radar had detected the forming bomber stream early, giving flak batteries unprecedented warning time. Hauptmann Friedrich Reichert commanded Flak Regiment 24, positioned along the primary approach corridor northwest of Nuremberg. His after-action report, discovered in Luftwaffe archives in 1978, described the preparation: Würzburg detection at 2,215 hours, range 85 kilometers. Clear weather, no cloud cover, excellent visibility. All batteries received target data by 22:20. We had 15 minutes to prepare, more than usual. Every gun was laid, every Kommandogerät calibrated and ready. The bomber stream began entering Reichert's engagement zone at 2,238 hours. His regiment, 48 guns across 4 gross battalion, opened fire simultaneously. The coordination that night was exceptional. Telephone lines connected batteries across 20 kilometers, allowing synchronized engagement of the bomber stream as it progressed through the zone. Flight Lieutenant George Harrison of 77 Squadron recorded his experience. The flak began exactly as we crossed what must have been a predetermined line. Not scattered shooting, but every gun firing at once. The shells were bursting in layers, some at our altitude, some 500 feet above, some below. They'd created boxes of explosions, and we were flying into them regardless of what we did. The German tactical innovation that night involved predicted barrage firing. Rather than tracking individual aircraft, the Kommandogerät calculated the bomber stream's path and speed, then ordered batteries to fire into the airspace where bombers would arrive in 30 seconds. The result was flying through explosions that had been placed there waiting for you. A terrifying inversion of normal cause and effect. RAF operational records show the result. 95 bombers lost that night. 71 to Flak and Flak-assisted night fighters. It was Bomber Command's worst single-night loss of the war. The loss rate of 11.9% meant that statistically, no crew could expect to survive their tour if every mission faced similar defenses. Post-mission interrogation reports revealed the psychological impact. Crews reported flying through flak so dense that multiple aircraft experienced simultaneous hits. Wireless operator Albert Thompson of 408 Squadron stated, "You could see bombers getting hit all around you. One moment they were there, the next they were going down in flames. You knew the same shell that got them had probably passed within yards of your own aircraft seconds earlier or later." The Nuremberg raid forced RAF Bomber Command to reconsider its tactics. The losses were unsustainable. Intelligence officers calculated that if flak defenses continued improving while maintaining this effectiveness, the strategic bombing campaign might become operationally impossible regardless of aircraft production rates. German commanders drew opposite conclusions. Reichert's regiment received official commendation, and the Luftwaffe High Command ordered acceleration of flak battery construction. By May 1944, heavy flak gun deployment had increased to 10,930 guns, with production continuing despite competing demands for steel and labor. The Flakgürtel was proving its worth in the arithmetic of attrition, even as Germany was losing the broader war. Behind every flak burst and loss statistic stood individual human experiences that transformed young men into veterans or ended their lives in seconds of metal and fire. The personal accounts preserved in squadron records, letters, and post-war testimonies reveal the psychological reality of flying repeatedly into the Flakgürtel. Sergeant Harold Webster, rear gunner in 115 Squadron, kept an unauthorized diary that survived the war. His March 1944 entries documented the progression from confidence to fatalistic acceptance. First op, terrified but excited. Fifth op, flak seems less frightening, almost routine. 10th op, realize we're probably not going to make it to 30. Just hope it's quick when it happens. The medical reality of flak damage was brutally immediate. Unlike fighter attacks that might damage an aircraft progressively, a direct flak hit often meant instantaneous catastrophe. RAF medical reports documented that crew members rarely survived direct hits. The combination of explosive force, fragmentation, and depressurization at altitude was almost always fatal, but near misses created their own casualties. Flight surgeon Leonard Cheshire's reports from 1944 described what he termed flak trauma, injuries from shell fragments penetrating aircraft without causing catastrophic damage. Wounds ranged from minor lacerations to severe trauma as fragments, traveling at supersonic speeds, passed through aluminum fuselage and crew compartments. Sergeant Peter Dawson, flight engineer with 460 Squadron, survived a fragment wound on April 12, 1944. His medical record described a piece of steel casing, approximately 2 inches long, that entered through the Lancaster's floor, passed through his left leg, and embedded in the aircraft's structural frame. He remained at his station for the remainder of the 2-hour flight, monitoring engines while a tourniquet controlled bleeding. The psychological mechanism bomber crews developed to cope with the statistical probability of death became a subject of RAF psychiatric study. Squadron leader David Stafford Clark, consulting psychiatrist to Bomber Command, documented what he called operational fatalism. Crews who accepted probable death as a fact and continued flying anyway through a combination of duty, peer pressure, and psychological compartmentalization. The phenomenon appeared in crew conversations recorded by station intelligence officers. When asked how they coped with the risks, Typical responses avoided discussion of personal survival. Pilot Officer Richard Stevens of 207 Squadron stated, "You don't think about coming back. You think about the mission, about your crew mates, about doing the job properly. If you start calculating survival odds, you'd never get in the aircraft." The bond between crew members became the primary psychological survival mechanism. 7 men sharing a Lancaster developed relationships of total interdependence. Each member's survival depended on every other performing their duty regardless of fear or injury. Squadron records show that injured crew members often refused evacuation if it meant their crew would fly with a replacement. This interdependence created its own trauma when crews were lost. Wireless operator Thomas Crawford's letter to his sister, dated May 1944, described watching a neighboring crew's Lancaster explode from a direct flak hit. "That was Billy's crew. We'd trained together since January. 7 good lads gone in the second it took that shell to detonate. Tomorrow we fly the same route, knowing the same guns are waiting." By summer 1944, the contest between RAF Bomber Command and the German Flakgürtel had evolved into a pure industrial competition, each side attempting to produce and deploy resources faster than the other could destroy or neutralize them. The mathematics were stark. Britain produced bombers, Germany produced flak guns, and the side with superior productive capacity would eventually prevail. Air Ministry production records showed British industry manufactured 7,377 heavy bombers in 1944, Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Sterlings rolling from factories faster than the Germans could shoot them down. But German industry, despite Allied bombing and resource shortages, produced 8,340 heavy flak guns that same year. The Krupp Works at Essen alone manufactured 1,288 mm guns between January and December 1944. Working with slave labor and operating under constant bombing threat, the supply chain supporting the Flakgürtel represented a massive allocation of German resources that some historians argue hastened their defeat. Each heavy flak battery required continuous ammunition supply, approximately 3,000 shells per battery per month during active operations. Shell production demanded copper for fuses, steel for casings, and specialized explosives, all resources desperately needed elsewhere. Manufacturing records captured at war's end revealed the scale. German factories produced approximately 12 million heavy flak shells in 1944. Transportation infrastructure, already strained by military logistics, dedicated thousands of railway cars to moving ammunition from factories to battery positions. The Reich allocated 900,000 personnel to flak operations, including gun crews, radar operators, searchlight battalions, and support units. The British response involved both technological and tactical adaptation. By mid-1944, Bomber Command equipped aircraft with window strips of aluminum foil cut to specific dimensions that created false radar returns, confusing the Würzburg detection systems. On raids where window was properly deployed, flak accuracy decreased by approximately 40% according to operational research calculations. Group Captain Alastair MacDonald, commanding 6 Group's Operational Research Section, developed new routing tactics. Rather than direct approaches to targets, bomber streams flew dogleg routes designed to avoid the densest flak concentrations. The penalty was increased fuel consumption and longer mission times. But loss rates decreased from peaks above 6% to sustainable levels around 3–4%. The Germans countered with improved radar systems, Würzburg-Reese, giant Würzburg installations with larger dishes that could partially discriminate between window and actual aircraft returns. By September 1944, approximately 200 Reese systems were operational, primarily protecting major industrial targets in the Ruhr Valley. The industrial contest extended to crew training. RAF Bomber Command operated specialized training units where new crews learned evasion tactics, practiced emergency procedures, and received intelligence briefings on German defenses. The training pipeline took 6 months from recruitment to operational squadron, representing a massive investment in personnel development that Germany, with its shrinking manpower pool, couldn't match. By late 1944, the equation was turning in Britain's favor not because flak had become less deadly, but because British industrial and training capacity simply overwhelmed German defensive resources. For every battery Germany activated, Britain produced enough bombers and crews to continue operations despite the losses. The Flakgürtel remained lethal to individual crews, but strategically, it couldn't prevent the systematic destruction of German industrial capacity. The annual reunions of RAF Bomber Command veterans, held at Lincoln Cathedral beginning in 1977, provided a space where men who'd flown through the Flakgürtel could finally speak openly about experiences they'd kept silent for decades. The recordings made at these gatherings, now preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, reveal dimensions of the bomber offensive that official histories never captured. Sergeant Arthur Williamson, wireless operator with 103 Squadron, described his 23rd operation in an interview recorded at the 1985 reunion. "We were over Essen, and the flak was so thick you could almost walk on it. A shell went through our port wing, clean through without exploding. We could see stars through the holes on both sides." Our mid-upper gunner, young lad named Jeffrey Price, said over the intercom, "Well, that was sporting of them. We all laughed like madmen. You had to find humor somewhere, or you'd go mad from the fear." The psychological mechanism of dark humor appears repeatedly in veteran testimonies. Flight Lieutenant Robert Hammond of 166 Squadron recalled crews nicknaming particularly heavy flak concentrations. The Ruhr Valley was Happy Valley. The approaches to Berlin were the Avenue. We joke about collecting frequent flyer points for every trip through the worst zones. It sounds callous now, but it was how we stayed functional. The reunion recordings also captured moments of profound emotional release. In a 1992 session, navigator Douglas Mitchell broke down while describing the loss of his first crew. "I'd been reassigned to a different aircraft that night because I was sick. My regular crew flew without me. They were hit over Cologne, direct flak burst. All 7 killed instantly. I watched it happen from another Lancaster 200 yards away. For 50 years, I've wondered why I survived when better men died." The survivor's testimony revealed the lasting burden of what military psychiatrists now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many veterans describe decades of nightmares, often featuring the same scenarios: being unable to escape flak bursts, watching crew members die repeatedly, or experiencing the moment of being hit. Squadron leader Philip Russell, who flew with 12 Squadron, stated in a 2001 interview, "I haven't had a full night's sleep without waking in over 50 years. The dreams are always the same. We're over Germany, the flak starts, and I can't make the aircraft climb fast enough." Yet the reunions also documented reconciliation and perspective. The 1995 Lincoln Cathedral gathering included, for the first time, a delegation of former Luftwaffe flak personnel. Hauptmann Friedrich Reichert, now in his 70s, met Flight Lieutenant George Harrison, whose bomber had survived Reichert's regiment's barrage in 1944. The exchange, captured on video, showed both men acknowledging they'd been following orders in a terrible conflict neither had started. That Harrison's words summarized what many veterans ultimately concluded. "We were young men doing what we believed was right, following orders from leaders who made strategic decisions we didn't control. The Germans in those flak batteries were defending their homeland. I can't hate them for that, even though they tried to kill me 50 years ago. We were all just trying to survive a war that consumed millions." The final reunion in 2015 drew only 37 veterans, their average age 92. The recording of that gathering captured frail voices singing the squadron songs they'd sung as young men, tears streaming down aged faces as they remembered crews who never came home. When asked what message they wanted preserved for future generations, the consensus was remarkably consistent. Flight Sergeant Edwin Taylor, who'd flown 35 operations with 57 Squadron, spoke for many. "Remember that war is hell, that it destroys the best of men. and that those of us who survived carry the ghosts of our friends forever. If our story prevents even one future war, then perhaps all those deaths weren't entirely meaningless. But never think there was anything glorious about flying into that flak. There was only duty, fear, and loss. The Lincoln Cathedral Memorial, dedicated in 2015, bears the names of 55,573 Bomber Command aircrew who died. Beneath the names, a final inscription reads, "They were young, they flew into terror, and they did not return. We remember them." The memorial stands as permanent testament to men who faced the Flakgürtel's mathematical certainty of death and flew anyway. Night after night, until either the war ended or their luck ran out, in the silence of the cathedral, where sunlight filters through stained glass onto the memorial stone. Visitors can still almost hear the echo of Merlin engines starting, of crews boarding Lancasters at dispersal, of young voices calling positions as they climbed toward Germany and the waiting guns of the Flakgürtel. The battle between British bomber crews and the German Flakgürtel continued until May 8, 1945, when the last bomber returned from the final mission of the European War. By then, the statistics had written their own brutal epitaph. RAF Bomber Command flew 364,514 operational sorties, dropped 955,044 tons of bombs, and suffered 55,573 aircrew killed, a loss rate of 44.4% of all personnel who served. German Flak accounted for approximately 40% of these losses, claiming 3,345 heavy bombers confirmed destroyed and damaging thousands more. The Flakgürtel had proven devastatingly effective at its designed purpose, inflicting continuous attrition and disrupting bombing accuracy. Yet it ultimately failed its strategic objective, preventing the systematic destruction of German industrial capacity. The human cost extended beyond statistics. In villages across England, memorials list names of men who flew into the Flakgürtel and never returned. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains 112 cemeteries across Europe where bomber crews are buried, many in graves marked "Known unto God." Crew members whose remains were never identified after their aircraft disintegrated from direct flak hits. Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire, who survived a full tour and received the Victoria Cross, wrote in his 1945 memoir about the peculiar psychological burden of bomber operations. "We were not fighting in the moment of contact, where courage and skill determined outcome. We were entering a mathematical equation that had been calculated before we arrived. Some would survive through pure chance, others would die through the same randomness. There was no glory in it, only necessity and endurance." The technological lessons influenced post-war military development. The integration of radar detection, mechanical computing, and coordinated fire control that characterized the Flakgürtel became the foundation for surface-to-air missile systems developed in the 1950s. The fundamental principle, using predictive mathematics to place explosives in the path of aircraft, remains unchanged in modern air defense. For the surviving crews, the experience left permanent marks. Veterans associations formed in the 1950s provided support networks for men who shared experiences most civilians couldn't comprehend. The Bomber Command Association's archives contain thousands of testimonies describing nightmares, survivors' guilt, and the haunting memory of watching crews disappear in flak bursts. Flight Lieutenant James Hartley, who survived 32 operations, provided one of the final testimonies before his death in 2003. "People ask if we were heroes. I never felt heroic, just terrified and determined to get my crew home. We flew into that flak because it was our duty, because our mates were counting on us, and because we believed it would help end the war. Whether it was worth the cost isn't for me to judge. I can only tell you what it cost." The memorial at RAF Koningsby bears an inscription that summarizes the bomber offensive. "They gave their lives that others might live in freedom." The 55,573 names behind that inscription represent young men who flew into the most lethal airspace ever created, knowing the mathematics were against them, and flew anyway. The sky over Germany, once filled with flak bursts and falling bombers, is quiet now. But the legacy of what happened there, the courage, the loss, And the terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare remains written in the silence. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.